Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korea marked its 80th Liberation Day with a pointed message from President Lee Jae-myung acknowledging Japan's efforts on historical issues, but firmly shifting the focus towards future cooperation. Just days later, Japan's Prime Minister Ishiba referenced regret in a rare statement, though without offering a formal apology. Now, with summits scheduled first in Tokyo and then in Washington, President Lee's diplomatic itinerary is drawing attention. Meanwhile, issues like North Korea's nuclear threat, regional security alignments, and growing U.S. pressure on defense cost sharing all come into play. So with the stakes rising, the question now is, where is South Korea headed in this evolving geopolitical puzzle? For answers to this, we connect to Choi Hyun-jin, professor of political science at Kyunghee University. Welcome, Professor.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
And also joining us is Christophe Godin, professor of political science at Kookmin University. Good to see you, Professor.
Yes, good to see you again.
So let's start with Professor Che, of course, with President Lee Jae-myung's Liberation Day address held on August 15th. So there he acknowledged Japan's recent gestures on historical issues, while also calling for future-oriented mutual cooperation. What do you think is the diplomatic strategy behind this message towards Japan?
I think his Liberation Day speech carried a very realistic and also strategic message. By mentioning Japan's past action, he showed that Korea is not ignoring past history, but at the same time, by stressing a future-oriented and also mutually beneficial relationship, he made it clear that Seoul wants to move forward. The key idea here is balance. Korea is respecting history, which is very important to the minds of Korean people. But at the same time, it is telling Japan we can build trust through cooperation in security, economy, and technology. And this kind of a speech shows the Lee administration's style of pragmatic diplomacy. The recent survey in South Korea showed that many Korean people still do not fully trust Japan. However, at the same time, they are willing to cooperate with the United States and Japan in security affairs because it helps South Korea's national interests. And this shows that the Korean people have a very practical mindset toward Japan. And I think this Lee administration's foreign policy towards Japan follow the same practical way of thinking. So this kind of idea was clearly shown in his Liberation Day speech.
Right. So the message seems quite deliberate, acknowledging the past, but clearly pivoting towards a future cooperation. Now, on Japan's side, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba marked the anniversary of Japan's World War II defeat by mentioning regret, which is the first such reference by a Japanese leader in 13 years. Professor Godang, he still offered no apology for, the colonial ruling. How should we interpret this approach by the Japanese head?
I think in reality, the Japanese Prime Minister is working on a very thin line because on the one hand, the past history has been the main obstacle, the main impediment to restoring peaceful Japanese-Korean relations, and this Japanese-Korean alliance is more needed than ever now because of Trump administration's tariffs. The issue is that, for instance, I'm European. So from a European perspective, the difference between Japan and Germany is mind-blowing. The big difference is that Germany, after World War II, apologized formally, and this paved the way to more peaceful relations and eventually the building of the European Union. In the case of Japan, as you said, as you mentioned, Prime Minister Ishiba has expressed remorse, regret, etc. But still, the phrasing remains relatively vague because he wouldn't say actually what he was regretting specifically. In fact, what I think, this would be a more personal opinion, but I think that the Japanese government wants to move forward because Japan needs Korea and Korea needs Japan now. But it is difficult for Prime Minister Ishiba to be more specific because, as you know, a couple of weeks ago, a far right-wing party, a populist far right-wing party has emerged in Japan during the general elections a couple of weeks ago. And it makes it very difficult for the Japanese Prime Minister not to express conservative and nationalistic views. So I think he just pushed his stance as far as he could go without looking provocative to this more extreme part of the Japanese public opinion.
Right. Of course, the Prime Minister also has to take into consideration domestic political atmosphere in the country. But this absence of apology does seem to leave a little bit of gap between the two countries still. But both leaders, however, are sending signals of goodwill. Attention now turns to the summit between the leaders of Korea and Japan set for August 23rd. Professor Che, what stands out is that President Lee will visit Japan before heading to the U.S., which is kind of an unusual sequence. What strategic message is behind this itinerary?
I think visiting Japan first is a strong signal. It shows that Korea values Tokyo as much as Washington, and treating Japan in its own right, not as a byproduct of a U.S.-Korea alliance anymore. And by visiting Japan first, President Lee is signaling that the South Korea wants to manage a relation with Japan more directly and also independently. And there is also a larger security region as well. The world is becoming more uncertain nowadays. Both Korea and Japan are facing very tough trade policies from America, and also the role of American troops stationed in East Asia could change in the near future. And therefore, in this uncertain situation, the cooperation between the two countries, between Korea and Japan, becomes more important than ever. And therefore, I think the President Lee is laying the groundwork for stronger cooperation in security and economy with Japan. And there is also economic angle as well. Both Korea and Japan are facing challenges from protectionist trade policies in the United States, and also we are facing greater challenges from Chinese companies. And in this situation, closer cooperation between the two countries could help both nations protect their supply chain, especially in semiconductors and advanced technology. And therefore, this visit can send one message. Korea wants to build real trust with Japan before stepping onto the larger stage in Washington, D.C.
Right. So we are definitely seeking for ways of cooperation in various sectors. Now, let's delve deeper into the summit itself. Professor Gurang, what key issues do you think we could expect to dominate the agenda? And also, I wonder if you see any potential for meaningful progress on matters like joint responses to North Korea or, cooperation in a changing trade environment?
Well, to add up on what Professor Chue just mentioned, the first point I think is worth mentioning is that President Lee's diplomacy is quite proactive. Lee Jae-myung, during his campaign, will not discuss honestly, most of the time, he dodged international issues every time he was questioned about them. Now, what we see is that this summit with Japan comes fast, with a very specific agenda. And to answer your question, so about North Korea or about trade development, etc., my money is definitely on trade issues, because Korea and Japan are facing the same issues as Professor Chue mentioned, to protect their supply chain. And both Japan and Korea are to be hit very severely by these tariffs that Trump just imposed on aluminum, steel, and probably more is coming in the next days or weeks. So Korea and Japan as far as we can tell, are finding a way to put the past behind and to elaborate some sort of common strategy. This strategy, what will it be? We don't know for sure yet, but it is a huge step forward. When it comes to North Korea's denuclearization, I would be less optimistic because in reality, South Korea and Japan have no leverage on North Korea. The only countries that could pressure North Korea efficiently could be China or maybe Russia, but of course, they are not part of this summit. Now, this summit, the way I see it, is to be very, very, very tariff-oriented, most likely.
So there's a real potential for discussions here on joint security and trade cooperation, but a little bit less in the North Korea front. So since this Korea-Japan summit comes just ahead of the South Korea-U.S. summit, it seems trilateral coordination is critical. And in particular, aligning with Tokyo may even help reinforce the credibility of America's extended deterrence, including its nuclear umbrella. Professor Che, why is prior coordination with Japan so important? And do you think it could yield actual benefits?
You just mentioned the nuclear umbrella and also extended deterrence. They basically imply the same thing. The concept of extended deterrence is very important for the security of both countries. But in the end, we have to acknowledge that the actual working of extended deterrence depends on the minds of American president, that is Donald Trump. And also in reality, his East Asia policy is no longer centered on stopping North Korean nuclear threats. And also, honestly speaking, it is not even clear how much he values the security of his allies under his America First approach. So I think we don't need to expect it too much that, the talks with Japan will help, influence and strengthen extended deterrence policy of the United States. But interestingly, this kind of uncertainty itself makes cooperation between the two countries, Korea and Japan, more important than ever. In fact, the history shows that Korea and Japan tend to work more closely together when the security commitments of the United States become weaker. And that is the current situation. And for this reason, now both countries are facing the same set of security threat, that is China's aggressive actions in the Yellow Sea and the East China Sea, and North Korea's missile and nuclear program, and also weakening American security commitments in East Asia. So in this situation, the stronger cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo, I think, is the best way to prepare for the uncertain future and to reinforce security.
Indeed, it really does feel like aligning with Japan ahead of the U.S. summit could be a strategic necessity for South Korea. Now, when talking about the two countries, historical tensions cannot be ruled out, and it hasn't been resolved yet. Professor Godang, in your view, do you think there's any chance the two leaders could make any headway on these long-standing disputes during their talks?
What we can see is that both leaders, that is President Lee and Prime Minister Ishiba, they did the best they could to come to some sort of agreement, some sort of settlement, without bringing up any points of contention between both countries. For instance, typically, the Dokdo issue, or Takeshima in Japanese, was never mentioned. So there is an obvious will for both governments because, as Professor Choi mentioned, they need each other, particularly when the US power shows weaker or less reliable, to put it mildly. So both countries need one another. And what both leaders have been trying to do, the way I see it, leafing over their declarations, is that they decided to address the past, but relatively vaguely. For instance, the way Prime Nishima did when he mentioned regretting the past without being too specific about the past. The way I see it, it is a smart strategy because for domestic reasons, both Korea and Japan are facing a rise of the far right. So it wouldn't be wise from governments to inflammate these nationalistic passions. It seems that President Lee and Prime Minister Ishiba are trying to implement a sort of step-by-step approach because both countries share similar interests and eventually, hopefully, as people, as nations work closer, it is not unreasonable to hope that eventually they will grow closer. The Trump administration is here for at least almost 4 years. And during these 4 years, I think both countries, Korea and Japan, have understood that they wouldn't be able to count on the US as much as they used to in the past.
Right. So it's a very tough time to touch upon sensitive issues in this very unstable geopolitical environment. Now, let's also touch upon the South Korea-U.S. summit. With defense cost sharing and the strategic flexibility of U.S. forces on the table, alliance modernization is likely to be a central theme there. Professor Che, how should South Korea navigate what many call Washington's so-called security invoice?
The upcoming talk in Washington will not be easy. The President Trump may connect tariff and defense cost sharing and also even wider alliance issues together. And his team could ask Korea to almost double its defense cost sharing. And also he may push for a stronger support for the strategic flexibility of American troops stationed in South Korea. So this means Korea must prepare for very tough negotiation. And from our side, we should be firm, but also practical. On the defense cost sharing issue, we can explain that we already provide large support. We are hosting American troops, and also we are paying much of the base operation in Pyeongtaek, and also we are contributing to deterrence against North Korea. We must also emphasize that too much increase in defense cost sharing could weaken Korean public support for the alliance. On strategic flexibility issue, we can show some understanding of the necessity of the larger role of USFK, for example, in the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea. But we must clearly say that sending Korean troops into combat, especially in situations involving China, will always be our own choice. So my view is that this talk will be very difficult because of this kind of issues.
Right. A lot of big events to discuss on the table. Now, let's also touch upon North Korea then. Denuclearization will no doubt be a key topic, of course. And with both Seoul and Washington maintaining firm resolve, do you think there is a realistic path to more advanced agreements this time around, Professor Godin?
Unfortunately, I will be quite pessimistic here because what we have seen in North Korean diplomacy over the last 2 years, more or less, is very clear. North Korea is shifting away from China and more closely to Russia, to the point, as you know, of sending troops, of dispatching North Korean troops, so in Ukraine, to fight along the Russian military. I understand that you're right, probably President Lee and Prime Minister Ishiba are to discuss North Korea because it is the most pressing issue when it comes to joint security in the area. But realistically, there is little, unfortunately, that Korea or Japan can do by themselves. It would require a higher power to pressure on North Korea. And when North Korea decides to deepen ties with Russia, the message that Kim Jong-un is sending is very clear. What Kim Jong-un wants is maximal isolation. For him, the nuclear weapon is the ultimate guarantee that his country will never be invaded, the way, for instance, Iraq was by American forces in 2003. And it's very interesting to see that as North Korea decides to get increasingly isolated, North Korea decides to get closer to Russia, who's getting increasingly isolated as well. It almost feels like Russia is turning into a sort of giant North Korea, and both North Koreas, the small one and the bigger one, are somehow getting closer and closer. So long story short, to answer your question, I don't think there is much, unfortunately, that Japan or South Korea can do by themselves.
Right, Russia becoming a giant North Korea, it's definitely concerning for many countries around the world. We'll have to keep close tabs on that and look forward to the results of the summit. But as for now, we'll have to conclude our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights tonight, Professor Godin.
Thanks a lot.
And Professor Che, we really appreciate it.
Very much.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.